The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Judge Ronald Hart entered, his black robe flowing behind him. Known for his strict demeanor and efficiency, Judge Hart was respected, but not necessarily beloved. To him, justice was a matter of following the law without distractions. Among the defendants was Dr. Elaine Taylor, a poised woman in her late 30s with an air of quiet confidence. Dressed neatly in a tailored gray suit, she stood out from the usual faces in Hart's courtroom. Her case was a minor traffic violation, failure to fully stop at a red light before making a right turn. The officer who issued the ticket was present, recounting the details. "It was a clear violation, Your Honor." "She didn't come to a complete stop," the officer said. Elaine was calm when it was her turn to speak. "Your Honor, I respect the officer's observations, but I'd like to provide some context. I did slow significantly, checked for oncoming traffic, and proceeded cautiously. My intention wasn't to disregard the law, but to ensure safety." Judge Hart's gaze remained impassive as he scanned the report. "The law requires a complete stop at a red light. Whether your intent was safety or convenience doesn't change the facts," he said. Elaine nodded slightly. "I understand, Your Honor. However, I would also ask you to consider the purpose of the law: ensuring safety. In this instance, safety was not compromised." Hart frowned, unused to defendants engaging him in such measured terms. "Intent doesn't negate the violation," he said, his tone firm. "The court fines you $150. Elaine accepted the ruling without visible frustration. As she gathered her belongings, she turned to the judge. "Thank you for your time, Your Honor. But if I may leave you with a thought, justice isn't only about enforcing rules. It's about understanding the lives those rules affect." Her words hung in the air as she walked out of the courtroom. Hart, caught off guard, found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The next case was called, and the rhythm of the courtroom resumed. Yet throughout the day, Elaine's words replayed in his mind, understanding the lives those rules affect. They were simple yet profound, challenging the very foundation of his approach to justice. As Judge Hart drove home that evening, he found himself questioning not the law, but his interpretation of it. Who was this woman who spoke with such conviction? And why did her words feel like a mirror reflecting something he had long ignored? He didn't yet know the answers, but something told him this encounter was only the beginning. That evening, as Judge Ronald Hart sat at his dining table with a cup of coffee, the events of the day replayed in his mind. Usually, the cases he presided over faded into the background once the gavel dropped. But this time, he couldn't shake the image of Dr. Elaine Taylor, her composed demeanor, her measured words, and most of all, the weight of her parting statement. Justice isn't only about enforcing rules. It's about understanding the lives those rules affect. He tapped his fingers against the mug, feeling an unease he couldn't quite name. Hart prided himself on his ability to remain objective, to uphold the law without letting emotions cloud his judgment. Yet, for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if objectivity had become an excuse for rigidity. He glanced at the small bookshelf in the corner of his living room, filled with legal tomes and court manuals. A framed photograph of his late mentor sat beside them, a reminder of the man who had instilled in him the values of discipline and fairness. Judge Hart had always believed fairness was achieved through consistency, through applying the law equally to all. But Elaine's words suggested there was more to it than that. Later, as he prepared for bed, he tried to push the thought aside. It was just a traffic case, he told himself. She broke the law, and I ruled accordingly. That's all there is to it. Still, his mind wandered to her presence in the courtroom. She hadn't been defiant or disrespectful, nor had she tried to excuse her actions. Instead, she had spoken with a conviction that felt personal, almost like she was challenging not just his ruling but the very system he represented. Unable to sleep, Hart found himself reaching for his tablet and opening the legal news app he often read before court sessions. As he scrolled through articles, his finger froze over a headline: "Reformer Shaping the Future of Justice. Dr. Elaine Taylor's Vision." It couldn't be the same person, could it? Curious, he clicked the link. The article detailed the work of Dr. Elaine Taylor, a Harvard-educated legal scholar and activist dedicated to reforming the justice system. Her initiatives included programs to reduce financial burdens on low-income defendants, alternatives to incarceration, and community-based rehabilitation efforts. Her ideas were gaining traction nationwide, sparking conversations about fairness and equality in the courtroom. Hart stared at her photo in the article. The same calm, confident expression he had seen earlier that day. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization settling over him. This was no ordinary defendant, and her words, he realized, weren't fleeting. They were meant to challenge him. Whether he liked it or not, he was already rethinking everything he thought he knew about justice. The next morning, Judge Ronald Hart sat in his chambers, the sunlight streaming through the blinds as he tried to focus on the day's docket. But his mind was elsewhere. The article he had read about Dr. Elaine Taylor refused to leave his thoughts. The more he reflected, the more he realized just how much he didn't know about her. Setting aside the stack of case files, he opened his laptop and typed Dr. Elaine Taylor Justice Reform into the search bar. The results were overwhelming. Interviews, academic papers, panel discussions, and even a TED talk titled Justice That Heals, a new approach to equity. Curiosity got the better of him, and he clicked on the video. Elaine appeared on the screen, standing before a large audience. She began with a story about her childhood, growing up in a neighborhood where law enforcement was viewed with distrust. I watched my friends and family get caught in cycles of punishment that did nothing to address the real issues, she said. I realized early on that justice, as we knew it, wasn't always fair. It didn't consider the circumstances that led people to make mistakes. Her words were compelling, and Hart found himself captivated. She spoke of creating programs that prioritized understanding over punishment, offering second chances through education and rehabilitation. Her tone was not confrontational, but deeply empathetic, rooted in both personal experience and years of research. By the time the video ended, Hart felt a strange mix of admiration and discomfort. Elaine's arguments were persuasive, and yet they clashed with his own deeply held beliefs about the justice system. He had always viewed the law as a level playing field, apply the same rules to everyone, and fairness would follow. But Elaine's work suggested that fairness required more than uniformity. It demanded context and humanity. He continued reading about her initiatives, including one that particularly caught his attention, the Equal Justice Pilot Program. This program offered sliding scale fines based on income and promoted community service as an alternative to financial penalties. It had been implemented in several cities and was credited with reducing recidivism and fostering trust in the legal system. Hart leaned back in his chair, a new respect forming for the woman he had dismissed so easily in court. But along with that respect came a troubling question. Had he been blind to the shortcomings of the system he had spent decades upholding? Just then, his clerk knocked on the door, breaking his train of thought. "Your Honor, the court is ready for you." "Thank you," Hart replied, closing his laptop. As he walked to the courtroom, he couldn't help but feel that his encounter with Elaine Taylor wasn't a coincidence. It was a challenge, one he wasn't sure he was ready to face, but knew he couldn't ignore. Judge Ronald Hart spent the rest of the day navigating his usual court proceedings, but his mind remained preoccupied. Each case felt heavier, his decisions tinged with a newfound awareness of the potential gaps in the justice system. By the time he returned home, he felt compelled to dig deeper into Dr. Elaine Taylor's work. Settling into his study, Hart opened his laptop again and explored the Equal Justice Pilot Program in detail. The program's premise was as simple as it was revolutionary. Justice should account for the individual circumstances. It proposed sliding scale fines that considered a person's income, ensuring that penalties were equally impactful regardless of economic status. There were testimonials from people whose lives had been transformed by the initiative. A single mother who avoided jail time by completing a community service program described how it allowed her to keep her job and care for her children. A young man who had been given an opportunity to attend counseling instead of serving time for a first-time offense shared how it helped him turn his life around. Hart found himself grappling with a mix of admiration and guilt. In all his years on the bench, he had never considered the long-term consequences of his rulings beyond the immediate enforcement of the law. He prided himself on being fair, but Elaine's work made him question whether fairness without empathy was enough. The more he read, the more Elaine's approach seemed to highlight a blind spot in his own judicial philosophy. She didn't advocate for leniency or disregarding the law. She advocated for a justice system that recognized the humanity of those who stood before it. Hart came across an academic paper co-authored by Elaine, titled Justice Beyond the Bench, a framework for equity in sentencing. It outlined specific strategies for judges to consider individual circumstances without compromising the integrity of the law. As he read through the detailed data and case studies, he was struck by the careful balance of compassion and accountability that underpinned her proposals. One particular passage resonated deeply. A truly just system is one that seeks to heal rather than merely to punish. It recognizes that while laws are universal, the people they affect are not. Hart closed his laptop and stared out the window, the weight of Elaine's work settling over him. For years, he had prided himself on his impartiality, yet now he wondered if that very impartiality had caused him to overlook the nuanced realities of those who appeared before him. Her words in court suddenly felt even more significant. Elaine hadn't been challenging him for the sake of defiance. She had been inviting him to see justice through a different lens. And for the first time in decades, Hart felt the stirrings of a change he couldn't ignore. Judge Ronald Hart entered the courthouse the next day with a subtle but growing sense of unease. The structured environment he had presided over for decades suddenly felt rigid, its cracks becoming more visible in the light of what he had learned about Dr. Elaine Taylor's work. As he reviewed the day's docket, he found himself paying closer attention to the cases and the individuals behind them. A single mother facing a steep fine for a parking violation. A young man pleading guilty to petty theft with a look of resignation in his eyes. To Hart, these cases had always been straightforward, a matter of enforcing rules and maintaining order. But now, he couldn't help but wonder about the lives behind the files. By lunchtime, the growing dissonance between his role and his newfound awareness weighed heavily on him. He retreated to his chambers, closed the door, and sat at his desk, staring at the framed photograph of his late mentor. "Have I been missing the point all these years?" he muttered to himself. The question lingered in the silence. He picked up the article about the Equal Justice Pilot Program he had printed the night before, scanning its success stories once more. Elaine's work wasn't about dismissing accountability. It was about ensuring that the consequences of justice didn't cause irreparable harm to people's lives. Hart thought back to his own beginnings as a young judge. He remembered the passion he once had for making a difference, for upholding fairness, and protecting the vulnerable. Somewhere along the way, that passion had been replaced by a commitment to efficiency, to interpreting the law strictly and uniformly. It was easier, he realized, to treat cases as numbers and rules rather than people and stories. That afternoon, he returned to the bench with a different mindset. As he listened to a defendant explain the circumstances behind a violation, he felt a pang of guilt for how often he had tuned out similar stories in the past. Though the law still required him to issue a penalty, he found himself speaking to the defendant with a tone of understanding he hadn't used in years. By the end of the day, Hart sat alone in the quiet courtroom, replaying the moments in his mind. His rulings had always followed the letter of the law, but had they upheld its spirit? Dr. Taylor's words and her work had planted a seed of doubt, but they had also sparked something else, a desire to change. For the first time in years, Hart felt compelled to challenge not just his decisions, but the very system he had dedicated his life to serving. And deep down, he knew this wasn't a fleeting thought. It was the beginning of a journey he could no longer ignore. The courthouse felt unusually quiet as Judge Ronald Hart stayed late in his chambers, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't ignore. Dr. Elaine Taylor's words and the weight of her work continued to challenge him. He had always believed himself to be fair and just, but now he saw the limitations of his perspective. He opened his laptop and navigated to the website for Elaine's foundation, the Justice Equity Initiative. The homepage showcased its mission: to build a justice system that balances accountability with humanity, ensuring fairness for all. Beneath it were testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the programs she had pioneered. Scrolling further, Hart found an upcoming community seminar listed on the events page. The title read, "Justice That Works: Addressing Bias and Building Equity in Our Courts." The featured speaker, Dr. Elaine Taylor. The seminar was scheduled for the following evening at a local community center not far from his home. Hart hesitated for a moment, unsure of how his presence would be received, but the curiosity, and perhaps the guilt, gnawing at him left him with little choice. The next evening, Hart arrived at the community center early. The room was modest but filled with an attentive audience of legal professionals, activists, and community members. At the front of the room stood Elaine, speaking with a few attendees before the event began. Hart kept his distance, unsure how to approach her. When the seminar started, he settled into a seat at the back, listening intently as Elaine spoke. She began with a story from her early career, describing a case where a single mother had been jailed over unpaid parking fines. That woman lost her job, her home, and her children were placed in foster care, Elaine said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. All for fines that amounted to less than $500. That case changed me. It made me realize that the system wasn't broken. It was built this way. And if it could be built this way, it could be rebuilt differently. Her words were met with nods of agreement from the crowd, but for Hart, they landed like a revelation. He had seen cases like that too many times, dismissing them as routine. Now he understood the ripple effects of his rulings in a way he never had before. After the seminar, Hart gathered his courage and approached Elaine. "Dr. Taylor," he began, extending his hand. "I'm Judge Ronald Hart. I believe we've met before, though not under the best circumstances." Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly as she placed him. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "I remember. What brings you here, Judge?" Hart hesitated for a moment before answering. "A need to understand what I've been missing." Elaine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then we have a lot to talk about." Judge Ronald Hart sat across from Dr. Elaine Taylor in the quiet corner of a bustling cafe near the community center. The seminar had ended an hour ago, and Elaine had graciously agreed to meet with him for a conversation. As they settled into their seats, Hart felt an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. He had spent his career commanding rooms and issuing rulings, yet now he found himself searching for the right words. "I'll admit," he began, "our encounter in court the other day left me unsettled. I thought I understood justice, but your words challenged that belief." Elaine sipped her tea, her expression open but measured. "Unsettled isn't a bad place to start," she said. "It usually means you're willing to question what you've always accepted." Hart nodded. "I've been reading about your work. The Equal Justice Pilot Program, your studies on bias in sentencing. It's remarkable. And humbling," he added, his voice quieter. Elaine leaned forward slightly. "And what do you think of it, Judge? Be honest. I know these ideas aren't easy for everyone to embrace." Hart hesitated. "It's not that I disagree," he said slowly, "but I've always believed that consistency is the cornerstone of fairness. If we start tailoring justice to individual circumstances, where do we draw the line?" Elaine smiled gently. "That's a common concern. But let me ask you this. Does consistency always equal fairness? Consider two people fined the same amount for the same violation. One wealthy, the other barely scraping by. To one, the fine is a minor inconvenience. To the other, it could mean missing rent or skipping meals. Is that truly fair?" Hart considered her words, his mind racing. "I suppose I'd always focused on the rule, not the outcome, he admitted. That's the challenge, Elaine said. Rules are important. They provide structure. But justice isn't just about the rule. It's about the impact. If the rule harms disproportionately, we have to rethink how we apply it. Their conversation deepened as they discussed specific cases, Hart sharing examples from his courtroom and Elaine offering insights from her research. She spoke of data showing how financial penalties and rigid sentencing often perpetuated cycles of poverty and crime. Hart found himself not only listening but questioning his own practices in ways he never had before. For the first time, he saw how his rulings, though lawful, could contribute to systemic inequities. As the cafe emptied and the staff began clearing tables, Hart looked at Elaine with a newfound respect. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said sincerely. Elaine smiled. "That's the first step, Judge Hart. Change starts with understanding." As they parted ways, Hart knew this wasn't the end of their conversation. It was the beginning of something transformative. Weeks passed, and Judge Ronald Hart felt the shift within himself grow stronger. The conversations he had with Dr. Elaine Taylor had not only opened his eyes to the complexities of justice, but had also begun to reshape the way he approached his work. Every day, he found himself reflecting on the principles of fairness and the role of empathy in his rulings. His interactions in the courtroom changed subtly but meaningfully. He began to ask more questions when defendants appeared before him, probing the circumstances behind their violations. He would ask about their personal lives, their challenges, and the root causes of their behavior. It wasn't about being lenient. It was about truly understanding the context in which the law was being applied. One afternoon, a young woman appeared before him for a second-time offense. Driving without a license, her story was familiar. She had been caught in a cycle of poverty and had struggled to afford the necessary documentation. Her family relied on her, and without a license, she was unable to secure a steady job. Before, Hart might have issued the standard fine or penalty without much thought, but now, after months of considering the broader implications of his decisions, he found himself saying, "I understand your situation, and I want to make sure we address the root cause, not just the symptom." He paused for a moment, then continued, "Instead of a fine, I'll direct you to a program that can help you navigate the steps needed to get your license. I'll also arrange for a reduced penalty once you've made progress." The woman's face lit up with relief, and Hart felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't a lenient decision. It was a compassionate one that still held her accountable, but with an understanding that went beyond the letter of the law. Around the same time, Hart began attending community meetings and working closely with local advocacy groups, many of which were aligned with the reforms Elaine had championed. He started to see the full picture. The intersection of systemic inequalities, the lack of support systems for marginalized communities, and the importance of a justice system that could adapt to these realities. One evening, he received an invitation from Dr. Taylor to speak at a conference on justice reform. He was hesitant at first. He was, after all, still a judge with decades of experience in the traditional system. But when he stood at the podium, sharing his journey from a rigid, rule-bound perspective to one of empathy and understanding, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. "I spent most of my career in a courtroom, enforcing the law as I understood it," he told the audience. "But I've come to realize that justice doesn't just reside in the rules. It lives in the lives of the people we serve." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. As Hart stepped down from the stage, he caught Elaine's eye in the crowd. She nodded in approval, a small, knowing smile on her face. He had come a long way, but he knew this was just the beginning. Together, they had begun to change not only his approach to justice, but the future of the system itself.